So just to let you guys know, I'm recording this meeting so that we can post it up to our website for folks to view later. If you put something in the chat, if you put something in the Q&A, if you speak or show your video, that's all going to be recorded for posterity. Welcome to the fall member meeting for the Pennsylvania, New Jersey chapter. You can see our agenda there. We're going to have a really short business meeting that Mary Ayres, she's the president of the chapter. She's going to present a short overview of where the chapter's at and what we're doing. After that, we're going to have a little thank you to Jim Walizer, who's joining us on the phone. And he's been with the chapter, I think, pretty much since its inception, and has been doing some really interesting things, growing Chinese chestnuts primarily, but really promoting the work of the chapter and work of restoration of chestnut. Then we've got Laurel, Mueller, and Jenise Bauman. They're both going to talk to us primarily about soils. Laurel will give us an overview for Soils 101, and then Jenise will give us an overview of what she's found a lot on mine lands, and because that's a completely different beast from general forest soils, and Laurel, I think, has some experience with that too. So I hope it'll be an intriguing meeting. All of the attendees, just so you guys know, you're all muted. You won't be able to speak. If you have some trouble or you need to tell us something, use the chat. If you have a question, please use the Q&A. We can use that to keep all the questions combined with the answers, and I can also use that as a way to type in answers rather than do them live. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mary. I'm going to stop sharing this main screen and put her slide up. And Mary, you want to take it away? You're unmuted, Mary, but I can't hear you for some reason.
Well, she's not unmuted.
Okay.
There you go.
Yeah, Zoom just gave me a pop-up saying, did I want to stay unmuted? Okay. So welcome everyone to the fall meeting of the Pennsylvania, New Jersey chapter. And thank you for taking time out of your day to come. Now, I just want to run through a few things very briefly. Some of these things you may be aware of from the e-newsletter that goes out once a month, but I just want to review some key highlights of what we're doing in the chapter these days. First of all, earlier this year, the board voted to adopt Pennsylvania, New Jersey as our chapter name, using that for all public-facing communications. Now, we chose and decided not to change our legal name just because of the amount of paperwork and time and effort and cost involved in changing our legal incorporation, our bank account, etc. And for tax purposes, I think it's also good that we remain the Pennsylvania chapter incorporated in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. But the change will be made gradually for all of our things like letterhead. We're not going to toss out letterhead until it's the next printing that will have the name change. The biggest expense will relate to changing the banners on the big displays that we use at the farm show and when we do outreach events. And it's not that expensive, but there is a cost associated with that. Our membership, I am pleased to say, has been holding strong, and our latest member report has us at 860 members in the chapter. We are the largest chapter in TACF. This year, our chapter income and expenses are on budget. We are running a slight deficit, but pretty much what we expected for the year. Now, I'd like to just remind you that in the fall, a letter went out with the fall appeal for our chapter. And we know you also get hit up by TACF for their fall appeal as well. So, but we greatly appreciate any support that you can give to the chapter, as we are responsible for all of our own operating expenses. In that fall appeal letter, there was also a ballot, a postcard enclosed, where you can vote for people on the board, vote for board members, and report your volunteer hours, miles, and expenses incurred on behalf of the chapter. over this past year. And if you haven't returned that card or you lost it, you can always just shoot an email or call Jean and give her your votes and report your volunteer hours, miles, and expenses. Those latter things are extremely important for grant documentation that National does that demonstrates how the chapters are very active and so forth. I'm not sure what those documentation requirements are, but it's very important to report those things. I also want to shout out that our chapter t-shirts and other merchandise are available since the holiday season is coming up. You can order them directly online or call Jean at the office. And I think you all remember from last year's Gettysburg meeting, and unfortunately we didn't have the farm, we did have the farm show. We have really, really, really nice t-shirts in short and long sleeve in a variety of colors. So do consider getting one if you'd like. Now our orchard and greenhouse work has really continued throughout this year. Luckily, COVID didn't have a super significant impact on any of those events, primarily because when you're outdoors, you can usually distance and it's not an issue. And unfortunately, of course, all of our in-person outreach events were affected by the COVID restrictions, but hopefully we'll see the light at the end of the tunnel next year. And all of our orchard activities for next year, we're going to update them at the spring meeting and in other communications that come out at the beginning of the year. Now, some other events to look forward to in 2021. Jim Searing is going to be president of the chapter for 2021 through the end of 2022. As you know, we have a 6-year executive committee commitment. You spend 2 years as vice president, 2 years as president, and then 2 years as past president. And I'm moving on to past president after my 2-year president term. Now, Jim, in his professional career, very briefly, he trained as a CPA and he was a partner at Ernst & Young, which is one of those global accounting and consultancy firms. And after he retired, he studied landscape architecture and horticulture at Temple University, where he learned about the American chestnut, and he started planting chestnut trees on parks and farms. Talked to him the other day. He said he was in the process of planting another 22 chestnut trees. He joined the Pennsylvania, New Jersey chapter board in 2016. And in addition to serving on our executive committee, he also serves on the national TACF board. And Jim this year headed the TACF public comment task force that coordinated the responses to the USDA application for the Darling 58 tree. And that was a really, really big thing to do. And we appreciate Jim stepping up to do that. Now, he lives with his wife in Bucks County on the border of Pennsylvania and New Jersey, so very nicely situated for our 2-state chapter. And a more complete bio of Jim, as well as communications on his focus, what his focus will be for the next couple of years as president, that'll come out in future communications. I'm not going to take more time on that now. Everybody should know the Pennsylvania Farm Show will be virtual, which is so sad because it's so nice in person. And we're not positive, but we do anticipate that the spring growers meeting will likely be virtual. It's usually held in mid to late March. Other things coming up in 2021 are we're going to have a small ceremony for installation of a new sign at Cadorah State Park, which is in Pennsylvania, recognizing Dave Armstrong's contribution to TACF chestnut breeding. And I think I have a typo in there, and that'll be in the spring. There's also a ceremonial planting in Clark Summit, Lackawanna County, that's scheduled for May or early June. And that'll be at Sandvik Corporation. So at this point, I want to turn it over to Kim and Jim Finley to talk about and honor Jim Walizer for his long and dedicated contributions to our chapter.
Yeah, Kim, you'll go first and then we'll turn it over to Jim. And then let me make sure, Jim Walizer, can you still hear us? Because I want you to say a few words too after we're done.
Yeah, I'm still on here.
All right, great. Kim, you go. You're muted, Kim.
Happy to offer a few words on Jim's behalf. Sarah asked me to say some things. Unfortunately, I don't have any stories or anecdotes because, at least as I can recall, I've never actually been in the field with Jim, and of course that's when stories happen. But we've known each other for a great many years, mostly through his visits to my office. I sit here and kind of the world comes by sooner or later, but Jim is often part of that world that shows up. And I'd have to say his, well, there's probably a social aspect to the visits, but I don't think there's so much social as purposeful. He comes in, he's got a problem to solve, or he wants to get some information, maybe test ideas. Sometimes he has something he wants to tell me that I might find interesting, I think. But anyway, they're always neat visits. They're like lightning strikes. They're unscheduled, they're unexpected, and they're short. Jim doesn't linger. He comes in with a purpose and he gets it done, and he's on his way. I always enjoy the visits. So I see in Jim a very active and energetic mind. He has interests that he wants satisfied, and that shows up every time he comes in. Jim, you lend great strength to this organization, and I think TACF is fortunate to have you among its core of volunteers. Now, there's hardly been anybody by here for the past 9 months. Well, not quite 9 months. I'm one of the only people who's been coming to the building regularly. It's like a ghost building over here. But when all of this is over, I want you to keep stopping by when you feel like it, and I might even put a mask on if you insist. So congratulations on the award and best wishes, and stay safe. Good to know you, Jim.
Thank you very much, Kim. I certainly appreciate that.
Thanks, Kim, and I'll turn it over to Jim now. Jim Finley, since there's lots of Jims and Kims. Jim, you're muted.
All right, so it's a pleasure and an honor to have an opportunity to talk a little bit about Jim Walizer. I've known Jim probably since sometime in the early 80s, and so we go back quite a ways. I will say that he is older than I am at this point. Keep up the good work, Jim. When I think about Jim Walizer, the thing that always comes to mind is he almost starts every conversation with a short statement where he self-describes himself as the dumb farmer. And I think any of us who know Jim will argue about the question of his intelligence. Will agree he's a farmer, but he's not a dumb farmer. He's a major contributor, as you've seen, with the kinds of organizations he participates in. Not only is he active in the American Chestnut Foundation or the Pennsylvania chapter, he works at Farm Show. You might know him as the Wood Whisperer, where he wears his bowler hat and his suspenders, and he tells us all about the tools of the forest. And if you stop at his house, he'll take you for a little walk and he'll talk to you about those tools, and he'll say, you don't know what this one's for. And of course, you always have to be just a little bit ahead of him and get an answer out to him. And that frustrates him, I think. He also has an amazing collection of rocks if you've never been there. He's also a volunteer with an organization that I have found, and that's the Pennsylvania Forest Stewards. And Jim has been an excellent forest steward. And in that role, he performs well what he always does. He's an educator. He's a teacher, and he's a good teacher and a good educator because he's curious. As Kim has suggested, he comes in with a question. And when he comes in with a question, sometimes it's based in his experiences and his observations, and he says, I need to get a confirmation of this. But more often than not, at least in my case, when he asks that question, he challenges me. He makes me think about things. And I think that happens with everybody he works with. He's trying to share information. He doesn't tell you what he thinks necessarily or that he's right, but he wants you to think about it and consider what he's searching for. He's always searching for information, and he looks back a lot to things that happened in the past because it helps him understand where he is now and maybe helps us all think a little bit about the future and where we're going. I consider Jim a friend. I look forward to his phone calls when he calls me here at the house because I've been retired almost 4 years now. And it's fun to hear from him. It's fun to hear about how his family's doing. I've had the privilege of getting to know Libby, his wife, Dennis, one of his sons, and Jason, one of his grandsons, who all have an inspiring way of looking at where they live and thinking about the community and the people they're trying to help. I personally want to thank Jim for all he's done for me, what he's done for you, and what he's done for all of us. He's a true friend, he's a true leader, he's a true educator, and somebody we all love. Thanks, Jim.
Thanks, Jim Finley. And I want to echo all those really excellent observations, Jim Finley. I agree. I love it when Jim calls my office or just stops by, and kind of like Kim said, it's unexpected when I like to call him Dr. Walizer, because yes, he always comes in and says he's a dumb farmer, and I said, well, it's hey there, buddy, and I got a question for you. Is pretty much how every conversation starts. And I say, hey, Dr. Walizer, thanks for coming by. And you're right, challenging standard expectations and knowledge and always questioning things and trying new things. So from the chestnut standpoint, I've got a few slides in here. I want to thank Jim Finley for helping put these together with Dave Jackson. All these pictures are courtesy of those two, some really amazing historical pictures, and a look at Jim's farm, which is just north of State College in Bellefonte, Pennsylvania. Jim's worked a lot with tree shelters and trying different types of tree tubes to keep the deer off of them. Some of these plastic kind of cage fence kind of looking things that instead of the solid plastic tube, to try and get rid of some of those issues that we have with the solid plastic tubes. He's done a lot of experimentation with that. Here you can see one of the Chinese chestnuts that he's planted. Now, while Jim is a huge proponent of American chestnut restoration, most of the work that Jim has done is with Chinese chestnuts. And I really encourage everyone to go to his farm if we can arrange some sort of tour. We tried to do something with the Chestnut Growers Association of America last year in June. Of course, our meeting got canceled. We're hoping to maybe do it this June. That may also be canceled, but hopefully one of these days we'll get a bunch of chestnut growers up there and looking at these Chinese chestnuts. He's done a lot of work on biomass. That's what you're seeing here, where you grow a bunch of chestnuts all together, really closely spaced, and seeing how fast you can get them to grow. Here's another shot of that biomass plot with Libby there in the middle. And then here's a recent trip that Steve Hoy, Sean Friedoff, and I took up to Jim's farm. And what I love is that Jim is always teaching us youngins. I guess I put myself still in that category. Different things. And so this is, so Jim's trying to create a timber type Chinese chestnut. And so this is a result. This planting is a little over 20 years old now, and you can see that he's working on trying to get them to grow tall and straight. And this has been his goal for a long time. Jim's always got his Walizer Farms hat on. He's always got a Penn State shirt on. And as an employee of Penn State and the Chestnut Foundation, I appreciate that support. So with that, I want to turn it back over to Mary Ayres. Jim, thank you for all that you've done and that you will continue to do. I know, Mary, can you finish this out, and then we'll let Jim Walizer say a couple words.
Jim, I second all of the thanks for all the help that you've given our chapter over the years. And we gift you this book, Norwegian Wood, chopping, stacking, and drying wood the Scandinavian way, with hopes that you enjoy it as much as the reviewers enjoyed it. It was published in 2015, and the English language edition got an average rating of 4.8 out of 5 stars on Amazon from over 1,100 reviewers. And it's described as funny, informative, and a great read. So we hope you like it.
Thanks, Mary. Now, Jim, I don't know if you want to say a couple words about what you're doing or what you're going to do or the future of chestnut growing.
Well, can you hear me all right?
We can hear you. Thanks, Jim.
Okay, well, I'm very excited to be considered for this award, and I certainly appreciate it. I know the greatest award you can get is from your peers, and that's certainly what this award is from. And they say if you win an award, next year everybody expects you to hit home runs. So I'm hoping that from here on out I can keep right on planting chestnuts and have some success with them. So I'm still on the program as long as I'm here. And thank you very much. Thank all of you very much.
All right, thanks so much, Jim. We'll do a round of applause. So Jim, I am hoping to put together maybe an article. You and I talked about this when we were out there this summer, putting together an article, sort of documenting what you've done there and talking a little bit more in depth, maybe doing some summary statistics of all that you've planted so that folks can see what you're doing, and some more pictures about those Chinese chestnut plantings. So with that, Jim Finley, Kim Steiner, thank you guys for coming and saying a few words. I'm going to throw you guys back out into the attendees area so that we can make room for, let's see if I can do that, so we can make room for Laurel. And Laurel, with that, I'm going to stop my share so that you can share your screen. And everyone, I'm going to let Laurel make her introduction if you don't mind, because you know yourself much better than I, but she is a certified soil scientist. She's working up in Williamsport, and I had the opportunity to meet with her virtually, of course, yesterday and learn more about what she does day to day. We've invited Laurel and also Jenise to talk about soils. The number one most important thing when you're growing chestnuts is site selection. And soils is the biggest part of that for growing chestnuts. So I'm hoping Laurel, she's going to give us Forest Soils 101. And I'm hoping that you all, and me included, can use this information to select the best sites for growing chestnuts and know more about how those sites impact chestnuts and how they grow. So Laurel, thank you so much for taking the time. I know you're incredibly busy, especially this time of year. Thank you for giving us some of your time and expertise in soils. Oh, you're muted, Laurel. I'm sorry. There you go. Perfect.
All right. Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Okay. And then the next thing I want to do is my share screen. Let's see if I get this right. If I just put up my screen.
You have to go down to the bottom and click the green button that says share screen.
I did. Do you see it?
No.
All right. Let's do that again. Share screen. Are you seeing my screen?
No, it worked yesterday.
I know. So let's just try one more time. Maybe I didn't go to the browse function from there. Share screen. And now let's see. I'm not sure if I'm opening the most current version. So let me make sure.
There you go. You started screen sharing.
Yes.
All right.
But
looks good.
I want to make sure it's the one that I finished. It appears to be. Okay. Okay, let's hope. All right, so now I'm just going to do the slideshow version. Are you seeing it now?
Yes, and perfect. Laurel, thank you. I'm going to mute my screen and myself. If someone has a really burning question, I'm going to ask that they put that in the Q&A. I am unlikely to interrupt you, except for time purposes. We're going to give you about 35, 40 minutes and listen to the wonderful worldwide world of soils.
Okay, so my name is Laurel Mueller, and I am a certified professional soil scientist, and I have a company. that I own. I started in 1983, called Soil Services Company, Inc. And I have a second company called Mountain Wastewater Management, which sells and services sewage system product, because sewage systems tends to be currently our main business. And I'm situated in north central Pennsylvania. We serve northeast and north central, and yet it's not unusual that I go back to my county where I started my business for 18 years, to Bucks County in southeast. Next week, I'm actually looking at soils for a monastery in Adams County, which is down near Gettysburg. And we just finished a design out by Pittsburgh. So we do get all around the state, but really most of our work is centered in northeast and north central Pennsylvania, and dominantly in the glacial till area. So I was asked to create a presentation, and what I'm not is a professor. I'm not an academic. I don't normally publish. I do a lot of presentations, and I didn't really have one on forest soils, but I was asked, since I work in soils, mainly in the forest every day, and I do a lot of contemplating and a lot of evaluation of forest soil conditions, and I make a lot of observation about trees and shrubs, because they're my clue on where the drainage is right for finding septic systems. I assembled this presentation from a sort of a composite of several other presentations, and some unique to chestnut growers. So I was asked to do a Forest Soils 101. And so I'm going to cover a little bit about my background and what soil scientists are and what the consultants do. And then I'm going to talk about soil surveys, especially the current web soil survey, which is the digital version of what used to be published books in every county, and how to grab good information out of the soil survey for your purposes, in particular drainage class information. And then, knowing the limitations of soil surveys, what can be done for high intensity investigations for various purposes, sometimes for permits, sometimes for vineyards, sometimes for mining. I have a client that's a tree grower. I'm going to give you a little bit about that. So what can we do to get more information, more intense information on specific properties about soil characteristics and suitability for planting chestnut trees? So to describe the soil survey, I'm going to talk a little bit about how soils form on a landscape, which is how it is that soil surveyors, soil scientists can actually make maps, because there's some principles of how soils form on a landscape. They are mappable because they're the result of a combinations of geology and topography, and because of that, they are mappable. And so I'm going to share with you a little bit about that. And the same principles are used when we do the detailed mapping. I'll give you some about soil profile descriptions. And then, of course, we're going to key in more toward the end of my talk about what soils are right for chestnut trees and how do we find them. All right, so this is just about myself and my business. I grew up in Pennsylvania. I'm a native to Pennsylvania, but I went to school in New Hampshire, a forestry school, University of New Hampshire. And I also did a master's degree in the University of Montana School of Forestry in Missoula. And but my focus in my undergraduate degree was land use planning. And I took all of the soils classes, and it was a different time. In 1971, I asked if I could major in soils because I was doing well in all the soil classes, and I was told that that was not for girls. Hiss, boo. And so I didn't get to, I finished a degree in resource economics, and I went and did a master's degree where I focused on soil physics related to forestry. And I graduated from University of Montana with my master's degree and got my first career opportunity in Medford, Oregon. And so that's me on the far left in 1977. And I always say this is the picture where I had a waistline. Anyway, things change over time. So that was me doing, actually it was a PR picture because there were no other women in the soil survey. And I was kind of an icebreaker, ground, whatever. I My claim to fame is I was the first pregnant soil surveyor, and they didn't know what to do with me. There was just no protocol for how to handle that situation. But I mapped until my due date. And anyway, it was a wonderful career. I stayed with the federal government for 7.5 years in Southwestern Oregon. And still, when we had 2 children, we wanted to move back to Pennsylvania for family reasons, and the government couldn't accommodate me. So I quit, came back, entered into a clock manufacturing company, my family's business, and that lasted less than a year. It was a terrible torture, and I didn't know what else to do employment-wise. And so as an act of desperation, I started a company. And so my first company was in Bucks County. I serviced mainly Bucks and Montgomery, Chester, some into Delaware, Philadelphia, and a lot of sewage system work. I did archaeology work, expert testimony, wetland mapping. There was a time there were 3 wetland mappers in Pennsylvania. I was one of the first of one of those 3. That was back in the late 80s. Eventually, my company moved to our family farm in the middle of nowhere and in Sullivan County, Forksville. And so anyway, this is just the evolution of my brochure. I started my career, as I mentioned, on soil survey. I was a mapper of soils, and my duty was from Crater Lake, Oregon, you can see in the upper right, all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And I did map about 250,000 acres. And when you do that mapping, you can accomplish in your agricultural valley lands about 300 acres a day. And it's all done with hand tools and reading of the terrain and understanding some basic principles of where soils fall on the landscape. The mapping in the Forest Service, the Bureau of Land Management and U.S. Forest Service lands, that was done at about 1,000 acres a day, again, with all hand tools. And, I wish I had then the tools that we have now. We didn't have a cell phone. We didn't have GPS. We didn't have topography mapping that was in great detail. So my way of soil mapping then was, I'd have to take an air photo and watch how the curvature of the logging road went and count 3 curves on the logging road and say, okay, I'm facing north. And that's how I knew where I was. So the soil survey mapping was accomplished by a lot of air photo interpretation of location. We didn't have just the benefit of, I used to dream, couldn't there just be something to tell me where I am? And GPS was only a dream, only a notion then. And the other thing I always wished for was the rocket pack, like something that would bounce you from this ridge to the next ridge with no effort, instead of hiking 6 hours to get there just to dig a hole and sample soil. And again, I emphasize hand tools, all done with shovels and augers and reading of soil profiles in road cuts. That's soil survey. So what are soil scientists? I am on a Soil Science Society of America board, and I'm also on an examination board, which certifies professional soil scientists. There is licensing in some states, about 13 states, and the rest of the states, there's no licensing, but we have this national certification process through the SSSA. Just my favorite Gary Larson cartoon of soil scientist school digging on the floor. The soil scientists have a Bachelor of Science degree, and then they have a big exam after 5 years of experience. And so your credentials are evaluated, and then you take this exam, and then you can get certified. If you are in a licensed state, or if you're an earlier version of certification, there were 2 exams, but there's now nationally 1. And then we have Code of Ethics, and we have continuing certification credits, CEUs, education unit credits. So that's just me, the old days when I had, like I said, my waistline. I have less of a waistline now, but that I live in soil test pits. So I just wanted you to know every day I go out, if I'm not stuck at the computer writing reports, I am in the field, and it's usually in the woods, and I'm being probed by roots from all sides after a backhoe opens the test pit. So I wind up in the forest a lot, even if I have a property with a lawn or an ag field. And the reason is I am usually in pursuit of soils that are good condition, well aerated, well drained, and where I find that soil is in the woods. When I'm in a cornfield, the soil is compacted, tighter, thinner, and in an area, especially in the glacial till, where the water table resides 1 to 2 feet deep, if that soil has had soil loss of the surface or compaction, the magic 20 inches we need to find for a suitable sewage system isn't there. But my observations, to find these places, I use trees, tree species, landscape shape to zone in on where it is I want to find that great soil. And I always ask, my very first question is, and this goes back to, I worked with archaeologists for 20 years, evaluating the age of strata for finding cultural resources from prior civilizations. And one of the questions is always, was this land ever plowed? Because the entire history is revealed. When we open a test pit, we can find, did somebody live there? Did somebody till it? And I might be sitting there at 2-foot diameter cherry trees, but it may have been open 100 years ago to 200 years ago as a broccoli field. And I can tell that history when I open a test pit. So a very, very basic principle always taught in Soils 101 is the 5 soil forming principles, for 5 soil forming factors. So a soil is a result of how long material from a parent material sat on a landscape and in what climate, and interacting with what kind of organisms. And when I say organisms, we're talking the plants, but we're also talking everything that died on that landscape. Soils have been the receiving zone for excrement and death forever. And soils have cleaned up magically. Before we understood bacterial science or chemistry, we relied on soils making clean water out of foul water. So whether it was the Roman bath water or dinosaur poop, we went to the soil cleaned it up. When the water went through soil and then rocks and then surfaced again in streams and or wells today, the water is clean because of what soil does. So organisms can be the bacteria, the fungi, the roots, the dead plant matter, the dead animal matter, all the little critters that are microscopic. So they all play into soil development. The parent material is the rock material or the deposit you start with. And then once you're in a region and you're in the same climate and the same parent material, similar organisms, the relief, where you are in the terrain, whether you're on the summit of the hill or the foot slope or the outwash terrace or the floodplain, that has more localized, causes more localized difference in soils than anything else. But because soils are derived from the parent, because they fall into a pattern on a landscape, and they change with the geology as the geology changes across the landscape, they are mappable. And it is because they are mappable that a person with hand tools can read a landscape and vegetation and go out and put a line on a map and call it the soil survey. So a little bit on parent materials. When we talk about parent materials, they are rock types or deposits. So a shale soil, which might be a bright red shale or a dark gray shale, will produce a fine textured soil, meaning clay, lots of clay. A sandstone, which is comprised of a sedimentary rock that is sand particles, will produce a sandy soil, often better drained, but not always. A granite, we don't have any granite in Pennsylvania, or maybe we do, but I haven't been in it. Or schist in south central Pennsylvania, we have the micaceous schists. Those produce very deep, well-drained soils with tiny little sparkle flakes in them. So a soil starts with a rock, but if it wasn't a rock, it might be a deposit. In my neck of the woods in north central PA, we have glacial till, sand and gravel and boulders that were deposited by a mile-thick layer of ice. And then after that deposit, we have, there were many lacustrine areas that were in the concave landscapes and beside the current river channels. There were large lakes that were formed, sometimes blocked by ice, part of the melting process, and those left a deposit called glaciolacustrine deposits. And then aeolian, and I have to tell you, aeolian is one of my favorite words because it has 7 letters, and I played it in Scrabble one time, and I used up all my letters, and that was 50 points. But aeolian means windblown deposit, and I didn't get credit for my spelled 7-letter word in Scrabble because it wasn't in the Webster's dictionary, but it is in a geologist or geomorphologist or soil scientist dictionary, and it means windblown deposit. And I'm going to describe a little bit about in our area. We have basically all over Pennsylvania, we have usually a residual soil on the bottom, but we have loess deposits, thin and thick, all over the top of the soil. And usually we will find a silty soil that's rock-free, that's part of that alien deposit. Colluvial means landslide, and alluvial, most of you are acquainted with, means a floodplain deposit. So a word on loess, LOESS. And if you're in the Midwest, they call it LOESS, but there's no R. It is a very underrepresented parent material in Pennsylvania. And when I find it on the landscape, let's see, its origin was glacial lakes that dried up and had no vegetation after the glaciers retreated, became the source of silt and very fine sand that blew. And it blew into areas like a snowstorm. And it's very evident today. I have the comment here, rocks don't fly. If I have a rock-free soil over a rocky soil, you know, one filled with rocks and stones, it is most commonly because the loess, let's see, loess is the result of particle size separation, meaning you're quite acquainted with gravel bars and sandbars in streams, for example. Fast moving water will drop large cobbles and sand, and slow moving water will drop as sediment, fine particles, the clay and the silt. So that's based on the velocity of the water. Well, the velocity of the wind did the same thing. The clays were stuck behind because they were clumped together, and the stones didn't fly. So what you have are these big drifts of silt loam and very fine sand that cover the landscape, and they are now part of the soil. The classic color is 7.5 YR 4/4. It's kind of a salmon reddish brown. So in every soil survey, in the old published paper soil surveys, there would be a landscape block diagram. And that was for the soil scientist that did the mapping to communicate to the user of the soil survey or anybody else who was trying to do detailed mapping, where do the soils fall in the landscape? Now, I don't know, I'm hoping my cursor shows. I think it does. But you'll see here's a soil called an R-knot soil at the very top, ARNOT, which is funny because it's kind of like an R-knot soil. It's mostly rock. And your summits will be, your summits are usually the shallowest to bedrock and some of the best drainage. Then your shoulder or your hill, or here the shoulder, there's Oquaga soil here. This is one common in the Northeast. Is one of your very best drained and deepest soils in the glacial till, and it's on the convex shoulder of the hill. And when the landscape slips into concave, such as with this Morris soil on the far left, MORRIS, that's one of the worst drainage soils around, and it sits in the concave part of the landscape. So the landscape drives depth to bedrock and depth to seasonal high water table. So it's really important. This happens on a very large scale regionally, but it also happens on a very small scale. I can be on a half-acre lot and watch the land undulate from convex to concave and find the soil difference in drainage just in that, in a 50 to 100 feet. So this is very important when you're spotting these areas for growing trees and you're looking for good drainage. Convex versus concave drives this water table feature. All right, these are just the tools the soil scientists use to make the soil surveys. In my logo for my company is the sharpshooter shovel in the upper left. Then there's the hard hand-turned auger. We have guides for how to describe soil. We used to have the topographic maps with 20-foot contours. I only wish then that the 2-foot contours that are available in Pennsylvania called LIDAR could be used, because those are so useful now. We use vegetation, so having to understand at all times a year what the bark and bud and leaf look like on a tree helps us understand by what species is there, a lot about the depth, a lot about the drainage. You'll see in a lot of my pictures coming up, there's a Munsell color chart, which is how we define the color of a soil, pruning snips to get those roots from not poking you in your ears and eyes, and sometimes a rock hammer. So I also used to have a good story that would help me get into public land. When you're not on public land and you're in private land, the good story is, I'm from the government, I'm here to help you. So you'd have to have a good story to have a chat, to go to a owner and say why it is they would like you to invite you in to look at their soil to be part of the government soil survey. The soil lines on a soil survey were done before we went to the field. All soil surveyors were taught stereoscopic vision. We used a stereoscope, looked at pairs of aerial photos that were taken in sequence, and these scopes make your eyes do a trick where you start to see 3-dimension. I used to spend hours and hours and hours on the back tailgate of a pickup truck with my stereoscope, looking at these pairs of air photos to try to make sense of where's ridge tops, where are shoulders, where are terraces, where are alluvial fans, etc., to define the landscape. And that let you draw the line, and then you go out and confirm within the line what the soils are that you're finding. And with the suspicion, you have a suspicion of what it's going to be, and you go out and confirm. Today, this LiDAR, there's a whole different method of doing elevation contour lines, and this is just a graphic showing how LiDAR is made. There's 2 parts to the LiDAR information, and I should say that we have this in Pennsylvania as a benefit of the gas industry. There was a negotiation between our state geologist and the gas industry about paying for making LiDAR available. So this is an image, and so if you were to do an image of even a forest today, you'll see the old landscape below the trees. LiDAR picks up both elevations and images that are below the tree canopy. So below the tree canopy, I might see an old farm that exists in what is today cherry trees. So in my own farm, we have what was a hay pasture when my husband was a child, and it's now got 2-foot diameter cherry trees on it. So there's a lot of land that was scalped, cleared for many reasons. My own area was just treeless for 150 years ago, and then the trees have grown back and the forest has come back, but some of the other uses are still evident in the soil. And so this is just a view of what you might see, and it might all be covered with trees, but it'll provide some evidence of what used to be. So soils are described by horizonation. The A horizon is the organic surface, and E horizon isn't always present. It is in a virgin forest, but it's not usually present in what was plowed. So the E horizon stands for eluviated. It means stripped of sesquioxides, and I'm going to show you what that means when iron and aluminum are stripped from the soil and migrate through the soil. They leave a pale layer and then a deposit of color. The B horizon is where there's the maximum structure, and a C horizon is undeveloped, without structure. And then R is, of course, bedrock. And each of these horizons has many other little fine-tuned sub-horizon sub-labels. So B might be BX for fragipan, or BT for translocated clay, such as A might have a P for plow layer, etc. Using horizon sequences and thicknesses, we separate soils through a classification system, and there are 12 orders in the world. But the more common soils in Pennsylvania will be altisols and alphasols. Those have highly developed B horizons. And then septisols, which are minimally developed. Those are ones that we find in glacial till. And we will find entisols on the floodplain, and occasionally what's called a histosol in a wetland. Not worth going into all those details, but know that we do have a classification system. And we also have standards. We have standards for the language we use to describe soil. Soil taxonomy is the classification system. We have the textural triangle for separating particle sizes into textures. Those of us that do wetland mapping have very explicit directives on what is or is not a hydric soil. There's standards for how soil surveys were made, and of course, certified professional soil scientists, formerly called the name at the top, ARCPA, American Registry of Certified Professionals in Agronomy, Crops, and Soils. That was the first name for certified soil scientists, and now they're just CPSS. So texture, we use a triangle, and it's kind of hard to follow this triangle, but on this side, on the left side is clay, on the right side is silt, and on the bottom, and it all goes clockwise in percentage from 0 to 100. So sand, clay, silt as you go around this chart. So you follow a line in, and let's just say you were 30% silt, 30% silt, but you were 50% clay and only a little bit of sand. It's a texture called clay. But when we're used to the name loam, loam is a nice healthy mix of all of those particle sizes, clay being the smallest and sand being the largest and silt being the in-between. So loam is a balance where you've got 20% clay, not a lot of clay, just enough to hold the soil together, 40% sand, and up in here, you're 40 to 50% silt. So a nice balance of some grit, some sticky stuff, but the majority of it is silt, so a loam. And then if it weighs heavily toward silt, it's silt loam. If it weighs heavily toward clay, we have sandy loam. I'm sorry, clay loam. And if it gets more sand, you're over to sandy loam. So that's how the textures work. We also are very explicit about the adjective used, whether it's stony, gravelly, channery, based on percent and the nature of the rock. A cobble is round, a channer is flat. So we're very specific. Believe me, there's a quantitative definition for every word we use in soil science when we do soil profile descriptions. So structure, very, very important. We find that surfaces are granular. That means round, crumb, soft. We find that subsoils are blocky. We have subangular, blocky, and angular. Mainly in Pennsylvania, we have subangular, blocky. And platy doesn't occur very often, except when man has usually had an impact on the soil through trampling, machine work, cropping. So those are your primary structures we have in Pennsylvania. And then friability, a very important, when you see lingo that says it's friable or firm, these are very important words to tell you about the condition of the soil. Friable is what we like for nice healthy roots and gardens, and firm is when the water stops moving through the soil and so do the roots. So this is just a picture of a soil profile description, the kind of thing I produce every day, so that we name the horizon. That this is a plow layer that's 12 inches thick. It's channery silt loam. It has a quantifiable color from the Munsell color book. It has structure, which is strong, medium, granular structure, very friable at the top. And we even describe the boundary, which is abrupt and smooth. So it has a shape and a span that a horizon change can be gradual or abrupt. So the B is a structural B, but not a heavily laden with, not a heavy clay subhorizon. So if it were, it would be a BT. So BW is a structural B. It's 12 to 28 inches. It's a different color than the top, channery silt loam, and it has subangular blocky structure, and it's friable. And in this case, we have a BX of fragipan, and it's 28 to 30 inches. Color is similar, but has depleted colors and concentrated colors, something I'm going to show you pictures of coming up. And usually just some comments also on the profile description. All right, so drainage and tree species indicators. From the mapping standpoint, if I were going to drive by a terrain, wanted to know what the soil drainage is, I would look at the tree species. And the same thing when I get down to the nitty gritty, I'm walking and I'm trying to point to where the backhoe is going to dig for my finding of good drainage for a septic system. So I have, in my own experience, there's a, well, let's see, there's a federal standards for wetland mapping where they rank soils into 6 different categories, from upland to facultative wet. They have 6 categories for saying which plants most likely are going to be found in wet soils and which ones are in well-drained soils. Well, before they ever developed that chart, soil surveyors and anybody mapping landscapes for drainage would rely on trees without such a scale published, but just the knowledge. And so in my own experience, if I want a guaranteed best drainage soil I'll ever see, I'll go to flowering dogwood and sassafras. Now, they're not very common trees, but when I see them, boy, I know I can get a good drainage hole. In my general experience, next rank down and more common would be black cherry, American beech, white oak, red oak, rock oak, birch, white ash, which is now dying thanks to the emerald ash borer, the sugar maple, the black locust, and crabapple and sumac. Those are all indicative of very good drainage. And this is where you want to be, if you're going to pick a landscape, if you're going to have use trees as indicators of drainage, this is the landscape where your chestnuts belong, because you want the good drainage. And when you start getting into species like red maple, silver maple, striped maple, spice bush, pin oak, sweet gum, those are indicators of poorer drainage. They'll go hand in hand with a concave landscape. So I've seen this map a variety of times, the range of the chestnut tree, and the range is not the habitat. The range is the full extent of where this tree species has grown, but it doesn't mean that all landscapes within these counties and this range will grow a chestnut. So you're going to start honing in on where the better drainage is by the convex landscapes. And so if you really wanted to know where does the tree grow, this map would be very speckled, limiting itself to certain landscapes. This is a generalized soil map of Pennsylvania, and you can see through Pennsylvania we have a lot of differences. This big pink zone in the northeast is your glacial till. We have the coastal plains, and we have the Appalachian mountain ridges through the center. So they're based on geology and based on topography and based on where you sit in relation to what's called geomorphic provinces. You have many, many varieties of soil, and yet all of the state was colored green for chestnut. So within the area that is part of the range, we're going to start zeroing in on where are certain soils that really do well for chestnuts. So using a soil survey. So this is just a real briefing on when you go to, you no longer use the old books, you go to the computer and web soil survey just by punching in the word web soil, and you'll get there. And you start with this green button, it says start here. And the first thing you're going to do is identify an area, and it could be 5 acres and it could be 100 acres. But I will tell you, if it gets to be small, you'll get this warning pop up at the bottom in this orange box. And I use this a lot in court testimony to explain why soils aren't exactly what the map says. A soil survey, if you zoom in really close and want a lot of tight information for a 5-acre tract, you're going to get this warning that says, that don't rely on this at this scale, because there's 5-acre units that aren't part of the soil survey. In other words, if the different soil was only 5 acres in size, we wouldn't even separately map it. It would just be considered an inclusion. So one of the very useful things is to hit some of the tabs at the top until you get to this one called soil properties and qualities and drainage class. And then you have to push this thing called view rating. And when you push view rating, this colorized map comes up, which is very, very useful for you to begin to envision. If you see this, here's a red zone that's excessively drained. And this yellow zone, it's well drained. And then you get to some of the, when you start getting the greens and the blues, as shown on this little, there's a little color-coded chart that goes with this, then you know your drainage is beginning to get impeded. Very, very useful, quick and dirty way to get information. But we find that the soil maps are not intensive enough for land development planning, for example. So when we are looking for stormwater facilities and sewage systems, we do many, many test pits. And this same technique we've used for identifying apple orchards, vineyards, and I'll show you the example of a tree grower that we did a detailed map for. Soil scientists also will carry through and do tests to get quantitative rates, such as saturated hydraulic conductivity for stormwater facilities, for example. We do mapping of wetlands and waters. Again, one of the restricted areas by federal and state law. So that's me on the left hanging a tree, flag on a tree, and a picture of gray soils that happen in the hydrology of a wetland. This is just Google Earth picked up one of my fields where I did a grid of test pits. This was a hay field that some people wanted to turn into a land development, and today it serves the gas industry in a bunch of office buildings. So those holes were turned into a map. From that, I created a map of varying soils. This particular soil was a miserable drainage in the center. I'm hoping you see my cursor. And because of it, it became a lake that was part of a stormwater facility. And the good areas for sewage disposal were all identified, and this property got built based on this inventory. Using always the principles of well-aerated soils or in the convex area. You know, when I see it isn't just connect the dots after we do all those test pits. It's seeing what I'm in on a convex landscape in that sampled spot. I can project across the landscape through the convex area. So really, really important. This the summit, shoulder, the back slope, the foot slope are a transition from convex to concave, and your good drainage soils are going to be in the convex landscape, especially the shoulders, because the summits are frequently shallow to bedrock. All right, this is a guy, a friend of mine in Bucks County who has a business called Trees and Travel. And his business, this is where I really got to understand the value of mycorrhizal fungi, which are in the soil, for tree growth. And his business, he basically sells $10,000 trees to people that need instant sheltering from something ugly that moved in next door. So if you want a row of Norway spruce and you don't want to wait 25 years for it to mature, you hire this guy. And this is done a lot in the commercial world and in high-end houses. So he has a Vermeer digger, but he grows trees in nursery style, but he enhances the root growth so that that's his hand holding a bundle of roots. And literally, if you had a regular tree without mycorrhizal fungi and in this kind of enhanced development of roots, it would look just like your hand. You would have little tiny root, coarse roots and no fine roots. But instead, he feeds these trees composted tea and compost tea and mycorrhizal fungi, which are part of a natural forest, and it enhances the root growth by bringing in moisture and nutrients from across an entire large landscape to that tree. So it's a very important thing to think about in developing hardy, healthy, transportable trees. This is one of his root balls under one of the trees he's ready to sell. And he was expanding his operation and was going to buy a farm next door. So he said, can we use your soil mapping technique to tell me where my trees will do best? And sure enough, that's what we did. So this is a map we made for him by a grid of test pits that were essentially a transect, a sampling in linear fashion across the terrain. And we were able to take the green area there and say where the water table and the dense fragipan underneath were deepest, 20 to 29 inches, and where they were even deeper yet in that orange area, and then where the water table began to come up. And which, if you are able to read the contour lines on here, all the concave areas are where the water table was shallower, even to the two blue dots, which were potential pond site areas. And we did the same thing for depth to bedrock. The map here on the right is depth to bedrock as opposed to water table. Digging was an important matter. So we found where was the deepest rock. Well, it was where the blue was a deeper rock, but and up on the summit where the yellow is, the walk got shallower. And then we had a really shallow ledge going through there, which is the orange. And then he was acquiring this land, so we also did a mapping for the purpose of sewage system feasibility, just to understand the value of the land if it were ever to be land developed. So that's the map on the left. So I want to explain about difference of going from a farm field into a virgin forest. And when I say virgin, I mean a place that was never plowed. And in my neck of the woods, never plowed is usually where the boulders are or the steepness is. So if it was just not worth it to the farmer to clear the rocks, because there were so many boulders that were big, ugly ones, or it was too steep to mess with farm implements, then those areas left undisturbed, never plowed, and possibly never cleared are the virgin forests. And they're my favorite landscapes for finding good conditioned soil. So
Laurel,
in those...
Well, sorry
Yes.
to interrupt, but if I can give you about a 5-minute warning to wrap up, and then we can do a couple questions.
Okay, very
But
good.
And since you're you mentioned plow, I have several questions from Steve Johnsonball. Maybe you can address that and then
Okay.
finish up on what you're doing. But he's asked several questions about plow pans. Is
Yep.
platy associated with the plow pan?
Platy
Platy.
soils, that's a structure. is connected with a plow pan, and I actually have a picture of that coming up.
Okay, and then is a plow pan typically a narrow, easily identified pan?
It is narrow, and it is often resolvable with some deeper plowing.
Okay.
Yes.
And then what, so yeah, and then he asked what's the best practice and low impact method to break through a plow pan? And I don't know if you have this too, but I encounter a lot of fragipans in soils that people want to plant on. Can you, I don't know if you want to do that now or later, but just how do you
That's
break those
exactly
things
what I
up?
have coming up as the pictures of the
Fantastic.
fragipan.
All right.
So
Thank
I
you.
apologize. I may go a little longer. Just
Okay.
than the 5 to cut these covered, but I have
Let's go 10 then, because we did
Okay.
start 10 minutes late. So if we can go
Very
about
good.
10 minutes, we'll wrap it up.
Okay, very good. Okay.
Thanks.
Okay. So in the forest that has not been plowed, there's a common sequence in the surface we call OEBS, which is the organic horizon, eluviated, which is stripped of color and stripped of aluminum and iron. And then where it all accumulates is the brighter red color, BS. So I'm going to show you some pictures of that. Most commonly throughout most of Pennsylvania, unless you are in a deep well-drained soil, you have a fragipan, and it is brittle, it is water perching, and I'll be showing you those pictures. And then throughout the forest, unlike the farm field, we have mycelia. We have a fungal life. The fungus, the mushrooms, have long tentacles that go through the soil and connect tree roots to nutrients and moisture. It's a symbiosis. Man's impact on soil are very, very visible. The compaction with the Palladian firm soils are something I'll show you a picture of. We are missing the original surface horizons, such that they're just gone. They have eroded and they land at the bottom of the field, or they run off in a waterway. The pH, once the soil has been limed, the pH is changed, and sometimes forever. So when you're seeking the acidity, the fact that it got limed 100 years ago for farming, that residual lime is still in that soil, and it doesn't ever return to being quite as acid. And then the surface boulders are all rearranged and cleared. And there's a unique smell of forest soils. If I were blindfolded and given a cornfield soil and a forest soil, I could tell you the difference by the smell. And I think a lot of that is the fungal matter and the decomposition that's in the forest soil. Okay, this is just an image to have you begin to understand the fungus life. And it's interesting, what took out the chestnut was a fungus that came from Asia. And today, the benefit, well, there's good and bad of fungus in soil. So the fungus that is the beneficial one is the mycorrhizal one, the one that's helping the roots get moisture and nutrients. But right now there's a fungus, 2 of them have been identified for the spotted lanternfly, that are actually working against that new pest that's killing fruit trees and ultimately nut trees. There's a fungus that's actually thwarting the progress of that pesty bug. This is just another image of how it's all connected. The roots connect to the mycelia, and the mycelia flower when the time is right into mushrooms. And in the lower right is a picture I took last week of some mycelia that I saw in a surface soil. And this is just a chicken in the woods. It's called mushroom growing on a tree. And when you do see the mushrooms on the trees, it's the first sign that there's something wrong with the tree. But some of them are wonderful to collect. So ground cover, very, very important. In addition to the tree species, if you're looking down and not up, here's a picture on the far left of cinquefoil, and on the right, Virginia creeper, and then the ground cover by hay-scented fern. These are all indicators of good drainage. Also detritus, that's the dead matter that's on the top of the soil, which in leaf matter. When it's black and gray and colorless, it's wet. And when it's tan and buff colored, it's not wet. So those go hand in hand with hydric soils. Of course, when hills start to sink and you start seeing sedges and rushes and ponded water and skunk cabbage and even a marsh violet, you know that the landscape's getting wetter. Without looking up at the trees, you know by looking down at the ground cover. So where you don't want to be for growing chestnut trees is here's a wetland flag going into a woods at the top. And you'll see the roots start popping out of the ground on some hemlock trees, and the hay-scented fern starts disappearing, and we go into the concave landscape where water is in the holes and the soils are turning gray at the surface. This is a fragipan. I'm glad you mentioned it, Sarah. When we open a hole and see a vertical stripe through the soil, it is a prism face. Prisms are a very large structure, often hexagonal in shape, and where we encounter the edge of them, we'll see this white stripe, which is depleted color, and right next to it, we'll see some redder colors right next to the gray. So that's the depletion, and this is the concentration in the fragipan. Fragipans are firm, they are brittle. When I say brittle, you actually take the structure and crush them in your fingers and it pops, it explodes. Redoxamorphic features is a new word for what we used to call models or drainage modeling, because there were many reasons that soils could be multicolored, which is what modeling means. So they came up with a whole language so it would be more clear in describing what do we mean by differing colors, because there's differing colors for different reasons. So on the left, you'll see a multicolor soil with what we call high chroma, that's the reddish orange, and low chroma, that's the gray, and combined, that's a redoxamorphic feature. When soils are uniform in color, they are generally well drained. So here's just a close-up of a fragipan soil, and again, there's a matrix color, a background color, a gray color, and a red color. And those three, all of that together are redoxamorphic features. But this particular clod of soil is so firm and dense that the roots can't go through it and the water can't go through it. That's what causes the perch water table. And there are other reasons for colors mixing up in a soil. So in a different pattern, here is a soil where the surface is an organic dark brown. The subsoil, this is your eluviated layer that we'll see in a virgin unplowed forest. It's gray, sometimes pinkish gray, and immediately below it will be a very bright red color, which is the sesquioxides. So the bright color left the pale color just by migrating down. Where does this happen? In sandy soils, in acid soils, and in well-drained soils. And those are the three criteria that your chestnut guide, the Pennsylvania Chestnut Growers Guide, says you're going to be looking for: the sandy, the well-drained, the acid soil. So here is just a handful of soil. Again, this is the depleted color and this is the concentrated color. And if a place has never been plowed, you will find this and can find it throughout most of Pennsylvania. But mostly, as we get to the more urbanized areas, the land has been cleared and plowed and isn't ever going to see this again. So there is a pH, there's many pH measuring devices, and I use a little chemical reagent one. And when this is screaming yellow, it's acid, and when it's blue, it's not, it's neutral. And I got to use this technique a lot on a study related to the restoration of red spruce in West Virginia. And the U.S. Forest Service in the Monongahela National Forest was looking for spodic horizons, these white and red soils, to determine where to plant the new plantings of red spruce, to bring that back, because that's an almost extinct species also. Earthworms don't like acidity. So my experience is if I see earthworms, I know it was limed and it isn't as acid. Below 5.5, they don't exist, and they need good drainage, they need air, and they create good soil conditions, and they are also indicative of good soil conditions. Here's the platy. This is in a farm field with platy soils. When I take these pieces of plates in my hand and break them out, they truly look like china plates. They just keep layering and layering, and they are the result of compaction from the top. This is way more than a plow pan. This is a lot of traffic over an area. On the right, I won't go into this, that was the Monongahela National Forest where the red spruce is being regenerated. And this old pipeline that was in there for 50 years, the compaction hasn't left. Here is a plow layer. So this surface has been mixed to 12 inches, dark brown mixing, and no original E horizon or BS horizon. So man has made this plow layer. If it regrew to trees, that plow layer would still be there and that surface soil would still be mixed. We have a lot of evidence of man in the woods: stone walls, hedgerow berms, tannery ponds, compacted paths, and dumps. As soon as I see the rocks have been rearranged, I know somebody managed it for agriculture. So we're back to, what does the American chestnut want? The planting guide that was produced by Pennsylvania chapter says well-drained, acidic soil, sandy to loamy texture. You can scout for good drainage by looking for the convex landscapes. You can find your way to those well-drained landscapes. You can alter acidity if you do not have the acidity, and but you can't change the soil texture, and you can't get rid of a fragipan. So that's why you got to find the convex, better drained landscapes. That's just me, and I'm done.
Fantastic, right on time. So I'm sad to hear that you can't eradicate a fragipan. I think that's I think caused a lot of issues, because often they're pretty far down, and so the chestnuts will grow for maybe even 10 years and do really well, but then that fragipan impedes further growth, and trees may die age 15, 20, and people are like, you know, what happened? And oftentimes it in my opinion, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, it's this compacted layer that's maybe 3-4 foot down.
Yes.
Would that make sense?
Yes, and that layer is aligned with the concave landscape. So the chances of not hitting it are when you aim for if you aim for that soil survey area that's mapped well drained, or somewhat poorly drained, and poorly drained are where you don't want to be. So well drained and moderately well drained are the drainage classes you want to aim for. You'll find then the species growing there indicate the good drainage, and at least 20 inches of clearance is what I would recommend. 20 to 24 inches of no fragipan and no evidence of perched water table. And your standards are really the same as going out looking for septic system sites. That 20 inches is what we need for soil to be aerated and to breathe and to support deeper rooting.
Now I've got 2 questions, and I know
Yes.
I'm breaking the rules by going a little farther along into the schedule. Sorry, Mary. But 2 questions related to Mike Alcott asks, how accurate are NRCS soil boundaries? And you and I talked about this a little bit yesterday. This is Mike's particular property in Potter County, where he's been doing digging and looking, and he thinks that, and I agree with him. I've seen this with soil surveys, that often what it says, they're off by 100 or more feet. Is that your experience, or what?
Absolutely. I mean, I personally made the soil surveys knowing that I did it with hand tools, 1,000 acres a day. They are not precise. And so when you're talking about a micro terrain or even 5 acres, you are not going to match the soil survey. The soil survey protects itself by saying there are inclusions of other soils, shallow to bedrock, poorer drainage, and you're finding those exceptions. And I would say a good 30 to 40% are not what the soil survey says, which is why you really need to stand back and look at shape and what's growing there. And you can do your own micro mapping, or you can dig holes and begin to look for these features of the modeling or that evidence of the fragipan. Yeah, if it's there, it's going to turn the root sideways.
Can you speak a little bit about the relationship between drainage and saturated hydraulic conductivity and permeability? How are those related? How are they different? And then, you know, I think drainage is important for chestnut, but I think even more important, not only how the water gets in, but how the water moves through. And I guess I haven't done a really good job for myself knowing, how do we measure permeability versus drainage, and make better recommendations to growers on how to measure permeability or KSAT?
Okay. I don't really think it's necessary to be doing KSAT tests and permeability. What you need is an educated person looking at a soil profile, and then it's all the evidence is just instantly observable. Where soil is permeable, the structure is loose. The friability is soft. I mean, it's not compact and tight. Where the fragipan exists, you can look at it in July and there's no water, but you look at that same spot in February and water will pour in over that layer. So between November and April, we have that seasonal high water table, and the water table, you know, the roots and the water all stop at the same point and they go sideways. And sideways means if you're flat, you're stuck in a wetland. And if you're pitched or sloped at all, the water moves away until it finds that concave landscape, but it still rides just laterally across this restriction. The restriction could be rock, but the restriction is more frequently this tight fragipan layer. And so there's nothing you can do to break it up, make it go away. You can elevate your soil like we do with raised beds. You can add material on top to get more rooting zone, but your best bet is to go hunting for the convex landscape without the fragipan. So you asked about, do you need a test? You don't need to measure it. You just need to observe it. You can test it, but it's just extra expense and effort.
Good, good. Well, Laurel, Steve says on here, thank you. I'd love to have you return for a part 2. I agree. I think there's just, I mean, I know that you guys go through years and years of education and on the ground experience to become a certified soil scientist. So obviously there's way more to talk about. And I hope that in the future I can pick your brain a little bit more, and maybe we can even come up with some standards for chestnut that are a little bit better than well-drained and acidic. But thank you for joining us and sharing your experience and expertise. That was really fantastic. If you can stick around, that's great. I know Jenise Bauman, she's joining us. Jenise, can you, Laurel, if you can stop sharing your screen,
Yep.
We'll turn this over to Dr. Jenise Bauman, whom I've known for almost 20 years, I think. What? I know she was getting her master's degree maybe when I first started in 03. Now she is a professor at Western Washington University. And I met her when she was doing some work with Carolyn Kiefer in Ohio, and looking at these same studies that she's going to talk with us today. So what's really awesome is that to be a part of this for so long that you can see a 12-year examination of what things are doing. So Jenise, thank you so much for joining us live from the West Coast. If you don't mind giving a little bit more about your background, I know you can do a much better job than I can, other than to say thank you. And it's been a pleasure to know you for almost 20 years. And thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. And I just wanted to give a shout out, Laurel. That was a great, I loved your talk. It was so interesting, particularly on the soils. And it's going to be very complimentary, I think, to what I'm about to talk about here. So thank you. Sarah, I met you when I think I was working with Bill McDonald at West Virginia University. And we met, I think, our first time at Penn State, yeah. I believe at social at a chestnut meeting. So it has been long. It's hard to believe. And it's so cool to keep in connection with you. So thank you for the invite. And again, it gets so exciting when you're able to now report on a 12-year-old study of chestnut. And I do believe that, wow, it gets really interesting in all stages of development and growth. But I really love the longer term interactions that we're starting to see in the field. This here, I started this in my PhD work under my advisor, Carolyn Kiefer, who we also met, Sarah, at another conference before, and also Brian McCarthy. And this was a collaboration between Miami University, Ohio University, and now I'm at Western Washington University on the West Coast, still watching this site, taking data. And like I said, it's starting to get really, really interesting. So this is an old enough study. When we did establish it, or we started to plan for plantings, we didn't have the 15/16ths yet, and the transgenic weren't even in the picture. Maybe they were kind of a vision, but they weren't really starting to work with that. So what we were working with were some of the older back-crossed hybrids. And I do find it important to at least report on and try to understand the resistancies sort of on a long term, maybe their applicability in agroforestry in the long term, and definitely looking at these planting methods as a way to get ready for the more advanced hybrids, and of course the transgenic, and how we're going to plant them and manage them in the silvicultural treatments that we can apply on them in the long term, or in the field in the short term, and then see continual data on their growth and success. So I just wanted to point out for this study, we used the 3/4 back-crossed American chestnut, which is about 75% American chestnut genetics, and the 7/8, which is about 87% Pure American. And then we ran it with our Pure American chestnuts just to particularly look at how these hybrids are growing in comparisons to the Pure American genome, and also whether or not they're showing resistance in the field to chestnut blight. So this field site here, talk about compaction. This is on a former surface mine landscape that was reclaimed using these methods that really cause a lot of soil compaction because there's a lot of continual grading. Back in the day when they're mandated to green up these sites, there really were no native seed nurseries to pull from. So a lot of these landscapes have been reclaimed using maybe non-native species and continual regrading, which has really resulted in compacted landscapes with non-native species. And in areas such as Eastern Ohio, Lesbedeza was a big popular plant to use. And I'm sure you all see this in the Pennsylvania coal mine sites too. Lesbedeza is a legume used because it will add nitrogen to the soil. However, we're finding that even 30 years after reclamation, we're not seeing any movement to forest. Theoretically, they should start to succeed a bit into forest through just natural succession into forest recovery. You can even see the landscape. We have pockets of forest, so we have seed sources, but we just don't have the planting medium for a seed to be able to be moved around and actually have a successful establishment in a mine site that's very, very compacted and overrun by very aggressive forbs like Lesbedeza. So this is the mine site we had targeted. And the reason why we did is we were looking at that soil profile kind of generically. So we weren't too in depth, other than it had a nice sandy loam that checked that box, and it had a pH that we thought was conducive for chestnut growth and survival. And it was on a slope. So we had this nice slope that would hopefully guide water away from the chestnuts and allow for a nice medium for growth. So what we were really looking at is, okay, if we want to use chestnut, particularly as a potential restoration tree on formerly coal mine landscapes that we have a lot of in Ohio, I know there's a lot in Pennsylvania as well. What kind of planting methods can we establish or initiate in order to get a really good establishment on these chestnut hybrids, and sort of pave the way to understanding better planting methods for also the more advanced hybrids as well as the transgenic trees. So for this study here, we set up a randomized block design. So in each block is a treatment, and our treatments are as followed. We have a rip treatment here, where we took a bulldozer in with a 1 meter steel shank bar that we just cross ripped the heck out of that site to really loosen up that soil. We also compared it to just a traditional plow disc that went about 30 centimeters in the soil, broke up a lot of that sort of thatch that was caused by a lot of that aggressive growth of the forbs, and it loosened up about 30 centimeters below that soil surface. And then we combined the two. So we deep ripped at about 1 meter depth and also plowed in disc that top subsurface there. The control plot was just left untreated with regard to compaction, but everything got just sort of this mow right before we started to initiate our treatment group. So we knocked back the Lesbedeza. We did not spray at this point. We just knocked them back, put in our soil treatments, and planted our trees. So at about a weekend, with thank you to Ohio volunteers from the Ohio chapter, they came out. We put almost 1,200 chestnuts in the ground in a weekend. They all got caged because, man, you guys know white-tailed deer run rampant in these mine sites. So you have to protect them or they'll just be gone within that first year with herbivory alone. So they all got chicken wire. They all got a little of that pterosorb, which is this auger type gel that you can add to the soil that holds in moisture. So we added that to the soil. We put in a little bit of fertilizer pellets and a weed mat. We really gave them A+ treatment. And then we walked away and we're just like, oh, please grow, please grow. So they really did. So the first year we got a lot of great establishment from both hybrid lines, also from the pure American. But I do like to point out, and you guys who have experience with the hybrids know that you're still seeing a lot of morphology that is linked to the Chinese parent on some of these crosses. So for example, after 1 year establishment, it was easy to see without even looking at the tag, what's a pure American? This is it on the left here, that nice straight trunk or stem starting to form versus the hybrids. And this would be the lesser variety, about 25% Chinese chestnut parentage, showing that sort of orchard tree morphology that you would come to expect with the Chinese chestnut. So really right off the block, we could see a difference in growth by year 1. By year 3, they grew really, really well. Because like I said, we didn't do any type of herbicide to prep for this site. So we were really counting on the upright, fast growth of chestnut to get up and above that competing ground cover. And the chestnuts did not disappoint us. So after year 3, they were up and over the competing herbaceous cover. So they weren't in any way impeded by vegetation competition, at least by year 3. And then we put in a little spot spray of herbicide just to kind of ensure that they'll continue their robust growth. We also looked, and I thought you'd like this, Laurel, we also looked at mycorrhizae. So we characterized within the first 3 years, and then afterwards it gets so hard to find a chestnut root from all the other stuff in the ground. But I think I'm going to try again here in the next couple years, get a nice 15-year idea of mycorrhizal succession on these former coal mine sites. What we did see, we saw a big player, which was puffballs or scleroderma. They come in very, very early on chestnut, and then they tend to succeed a little bit into, let's see, this is a hebeloma. That was a very early colonizer, and then they tend to give way to this Cortinarius. And both the hebeloma and Cortinarius are mushroom forming fungi. And we also found the Cenococcum, which is a very interesting, has a very dark black hyphae and radiating, or I should say sheath, dark black sheath, and this neat radiating dark black hyphae. And again, like Laura was saying, definitely helps the tree maximize their ability to take up water and nutrients. And we did find a significant impact that our soil treatments have on mycorrhizal formation, and that agrees with the literature. The more oxygen in the soil, the more the ability for that tree root to really extend itself and to make its symbioses with its symbionts is so critical that there's air and porous and ability for that symbiosis to form. So the soil treatments definitely boosted mycorrhizae functional symbioses in the field. After year 4, we were, like I said, these chestnuts continued to really amaze us on the site. They were tall, they're starting to cast shade on the ground, and they were reproducing by age 4. Well, they were really age 5 because they were planted as a 1-year-old bare root seedling. But after 4 years in the field, they started to form burrs. And that we found to be associated with our treatments. As long as we had some type of compaction treatment, we had lots and lots of reproduction of all of our chestnut lines in the field. So we returned at year 11 and we took some survival and growth data. So this is fun when you actually don't have to show charts and graphs to get your point across. Right, here we go. But then don't worry, you stats gurus, I'm gonna go into charts and graphs after this. But just, wow, we got a lot of great growth out of our plots that had that ripping treatment in there. Plow disc also performed in the early years. What we did see was, wow, this super growth from the ripped treatments where the plow disc kind of came in second, and they were just overwhelmingly taller and more healthy than the control plot. So you can see those control plots down here in the bottom right side of my PowerPoint. So after 11 years, that pattern of soil treatment just showed to be so important for chestnuts. Chestnut's ability to reproduce, chestnut's ability to find and maintain functional mycorrhizae in the field. And if we want to look at then survival by treatment, so I promised, right, charts and graphs, what we're seeing here is my neon green bars is survival. So on my x-axis, I have our treatments. On the y is whether or not they survive. So our green bars are showing that the plow disc, rip plow disc, as long as they had some type of soil treatment, they had much higher survival over time. So our rip plot did the best, but really on a significance level, as long as there's a mechanical soil treatment, there was much higher survival. And when we think about a coal mine reclamation project, when we get 70% survival on a site, we're thrilled. So the ripping method definitely really increased that ability to survive. And then if we look at height, so now we're looking at the same treatments on the x-axis there, control, plowed disc, rip plowed disc, and height as a metric on our y-axis here. You can see that, again, as long as we had that mechanical treatment, we had significantly taller chestnuts. We also saw this pattern repeat with our root collar diameter. That too is a nice indicator of growth, not only above ground, but it's also significantly related to below ground root growth. So we had a nice bolstering of both above, below ground root, as long as we had that soil treatment. Now, interestingly enough to me, and this again is going to connect, I believe, to what Laurel was saying in her talk, is that, remember I said in the beginning, if it was ripped, those plants took off and they were taller, they were bigger, with plow and disc kind of coming in second place. After 11 years and 12 years in the field, what we found is that the plow disc actually caught up. So I'm curious to see if, is 1 meter depth ripped deep enough to actually aid the chestnuts into that real deep root growth, and it may not. So if we're seeing this sort of catch up in year 11 and 12 with the plow disc trees, this kind of makes me kind of wonder if 1 meter depth is actually deep enough. But that's something we can kind of look into over time. When we look at survival, now we're looking and comparing our tree types. So when we ran our analysis, we didn't get an interaction between actual tree type and treatment. So that therefore we can look at each of our sort of treatments, both tree type and treatment separately. So now we're looking at our green bars are looking at survival by tree type. We have our 2 hybrids. So the BC1F3, that again was about 75% American chestnut. BC2F3 was our 87% American chestnut genome. And after 12 years, what we're seeing is an increase in survival on those hybrids. So both of those chestnut lines had significantly higher survival when compared to that pure American over time. So that's something that we saw that trend happening throughout the study, but after 12 years, those hybrids are recording a higher survival. And then when we look at the heights over time, we see then one of our hybrids are doing just as well as the pure American height-wise. Now, the question here, is it catching up with pure American over time? Because are we starting to see some dieback on the pure American? So I can't really say this is the morphology of this hybrid as much as it's probably the resistance that this hybrid is showing to natural blight affection that's going through the field. So I'd like to go ahead and kind of show you what we did to try to quantify and qualify blight infection. So we didn't release Cryphonectria. We did notice after year 4 or 5, just as those chestnuts were starting to reproduce, we started noticing small cankers in our field site. We didn't do anything to stop it or to encourage its spread, but we wanted to track that through time. So after 11 field seasons, we characterized stromas with different ratings. 0 means we didn't find anything that looked like a canker on those trees. For a rating of 1, it had some type of wound, and we really could not tell whether or not this was just sort of a freeze-thaw event. Maybe it was from wildlife, maybe it was from another pathogen, and we did not see any type of orange stroma that's generally associated with Cryphonectria parasitica. But we went ahead and ranked that 1. That's a 1 canker rating there. Or the one in the middle, this is a moderate canker. We see stroma present. We see some necrotic tissue forming. And then lastly, number 3, it ranked them severe cankers when we saw this overwhelming girdling, evident presence of stroma, a lot of necrotic tissue. That got that canker rating of 3. We also pulled bark plugs out of these trees, grew Cryphonectria out on plates to confirm that what we're seeing here in the orange pustules were Cryphonectria as they were identified growing out of that canker. So we do know that we do have for sure the presence of Cryphonectria. And then looking at those canker ratings, what I'd like to show you is on the bottom there on our x-axis, we have the 2 hybrids compared to that pure American. On our y-axis there, we have our canker ratings. So what you can see is after 11 years, the pure American had significantly more. So I'm just looking at this big fire orange red, I guess red-orange bar here showing that pure American had the majority of those real severe canker infections. They also had the moderate cankers, the stroma present, as well as some of those insignificant cankers as well. And this was significantly higher. This blight incidence was significantly higher on the pure Americans, showing that we do have some resistance building, or at least illustrating resistance in the field from these hybrids here. The BC1F3, I had mentioned that it was growing just as tall as the pure American, but just anecdotally, I guess I could tell you that as I was in the field watching these pure Americans kind of die back due to that canker infection, that the BC1F3s aren't quite growing as robust, say, as a pure American would, but they're showing such resistance that they are getting to be big, nice, reproducing trees in the field. So we also wanted to know, okay, after 12 years, 11, 12 years, what's growing with chestnut in the field? It was all Lesbedeza pretty much. And then if you kind of parted that Lesbedeza, there was a lot of fescue. So there was really very little native. Oops, one thing I did want to show, well, let me go back to that. But first, let's talk about herbaceous competition that was also growing around the chestnuts. We had Lesbedeza did come back, but again, that's now an understory plant. It's growing underneath our chestnuts and they're starting to phase out. So they were pretty much about 80% cover before we started the study. Now they're sitting about 30% cover. Also, what's moving into the site is smooth brome. It's another non-native that can be invasive in some of these sites. That's at about 18%. So that's kind of the bad news. The bad news regarding herbaceous competition is we really are always going to have this pressure from invasive species that were seeded in upon original reclamation. But the good news is we're starting to see some native species come in as well and growing with the Lesbedeza and the brome. And that would be the Canada goldenrod. That's coming in really, really nicely. Allegheny blackberry, that's there, and always a good sign that your soil is really ready for trees to be planted in. And then we also have this tall fescue that was introduced, and what's kind of on the horizon there, we characterized it as herbaceous, is this Amur honeysuckle, is newish to our site, although there's plenty in the county, but we're starting to see this Amur honeysuckle come into the site. So we didn't see anything different among our treatments, but this is just showing that the site, we do have to continue to manage for invasive species. When we have our woody composition, pardon me, we're seeing Allegheny blackberry. That again, we characterize it both as herbaceous when it's really little and growing around our trees. When they get waist high, they're really the more abundant woody species out there, which is good, except if you're tangled up in it. But for the most part, at least ecologically, it's really, really good. Your honeysuckle, again, is what we're going to have to seriously consider managing for over time. We also have some native species coming in, smooth sumac, poison ivy. That's also fun to be tangled up in. Good news ecologically, bad news if you're a surveyor, and then grapevine. So again, we really didn't see too much on differences across our plots here, but we did find some interesting plants out there, and that's these next generation chestnuts that are seeding themselves in. from their parents, and we don't know their lineage because we don't know how, if they're crossing or what, but we are starting to see seedlings. So this could potentially be a nice sustainable population of chestnuts over time, we hope. So again, I had mentioned that they started producing nuts very, very young. I also mentioned that there could be some applications, not only as these hybrid chestnuts as restoration trees, but potentially as these chestnuts as an agroforestry crop in some of these areas where they're not quite being used for active farmland. They have the potential to succeed into forests upon correct planting methods, or they could be managed as an orchard crop. And again, they're producing nuts nicely. But our question, though, that being on a mine site where the reclamation is a bit, well, unknown with regard to that soil profile. We do know that they came in, they extracted that coal resource. They filled in the holes with spoil material. What I mean by spoil material, it's rock material, parental bedrock material with chips of coal still embedded in that. So that can create a very acidic condition, as well as compromise your natural underground water aquifers. So we were kind of wondering, would there be an issue with heavy metals as those trees grow and root deeper? Because upon reclamation, they bury the spoil, they cap it off, they cover it, they bury it with, the specs say 18 inches of topsoil. And we know we rip deeper than that. So we were just kind of wondering if there's going to be any interaction with the chestnut roots and their ability to pull up any metals that could possibly translate into heavy metals in chestnut tissue. And importantly, if we're thinking of this as an agroforestry crop, into that nut material. So at year 12, we sampled the foliage and the nut tissue for heavy metals. And what you're seeing here, the green bars are our leaf tissue. The brown bars are the nut tissue. And of course, on the x-axis, I have leaf and nut printed out for you. On the y-axis are the levels of metals. And my gray background, or my gray bars that you see, are the natural range of these metals in tissue. So what we are seeing is manganese. Wow, chestnut is a hyper accumulator of manganese. In fact, doing a little literature search after this, I found that Chinese chestnut is used in China a lot for some of these reclaimed mine sites because they will hyper accumulate manganese. And it was playing out on our site as well. So the leaf tissue had so much manganese registering in that leaf tissue. However, when we looked at the nut tissue, and interestingly enough, it was really on the bottom sort of normal range of manganese. So that I think all of these data show that even if the leaf is sequestering some of these potential heavy metals, the nut tissue is not. So again, we have zinc. We did not have levels that even reached anything normal. Maybe we even have a deficiency here with zinc anyway. Cadmium here has levels far below anything that would be concerning with regard to ingesting, whether it's wildlife or people. Arsenic, we're low in the normal range of arsenic within that tree tissue, as well as copper. We are quite low in the leaf, and it is also interesting to see how different parts of the plant sequester metals differently. And in this case, they did have a higher level of copper within that nut tissue. However, it was not in any way a range that would be dangerous for ingestion. So after looking at these metals, and again, this is one site, sort of a snapshot. So I would encourage, more work that looks at the interaction of heavy metals and tissue if they are planted on mine sites, just to ensure that safety for wildlife that will be ingesting some of these plant parts, as well as potential for agroforestry crops within this area. So, okay. So a research summary here, either soil treatment yielded greater survival, growth, and seed set. I am concerned that because our plow disc, which was only 30 centimeters of loosening up that soil, might not be deep enough. I'm sorry, it might be indicative of the fact that our ripping event might not be deep enough to really ensure long-term survival. Again, these are now 12-year-olds. In this study, we're going to go back in a couple years and take another look. We do have reason to be concerned of Phytophthora. We saw some signs that Phytophthora might be lurking in our site. And we also want to take a look at mycorrhizae after 15 years. So we're planning on returning and seeing how they do after another few years regarding that treatment and height and growth. We did see significantly less chestnut blight on our hybrid trees. So those, they're not the advanced hybrids, but they're nice trees. They're growing well, they're growing fast, and they're producing nuts. And that could, like I say, have a role in some type of agroforestry within some of these marginal landscapes. We will have to continue managing at least for invasive species. I am nervous about that honeysuckle. They can come in and displace trees. Honeysuckle was not there prior to our study, so that's something that's moving in over time. I mentioned that we do want to keep looking at Phytophthora, and over time kind of keeping our eye on metal levels and ensuring that that tissue is safe for the food chain as well as possible human consumption. So I want to thank Western Washington University, Ohio chapter, American Chestnut. They provided funding for the study. It was set up on an original grant with the Department of the Interior. Those of you all who may have met Carolyn Kiefer through these, she brought her class out on a very beautiful fall day in Dresden, Ohio, and helped me collect all of these data. So thank you. And also thank you for the invite. I meant to start with that, Sarah. So I really appreciate the invite to this event today. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jenise. Hey, we got a couple questions for you. And so one is from Steve Johnson Ball. Are you caging your volunteer chestnuts?
We're not. No, and that really is bandwidth, right? Time and field labor time too. But that, let me note that, because moving forward, we really should be. And next time we do return to the site in a couple years, we will check them out, flag them, and kind of add that on our list. And I'd like to take some tissue and see if we can't get some type of DNA analysis on their parentage too. So great question.
Yeah, I'd be really interested actually to not cage them, because I mean, right, the whole point of restoration and reintroduction is to see how these progeny do and follow up. And at some point, people might cage things, but I'd be more interested to see if you can flag them and follow them, are they able to withstand any sort of the predation or herbivory that might just be interesting.
Thank you.
Follow from that
perspective.
And less work maybe, I don't know.
Thank you for that feedback. Less work, we can definitely do it. And you're right, it would, that is the goal. The goal is to plant and walk away.
Yeah.
So that would be interesting. I'm kind of torn, right, between do we want to save this to collect for nuts or just save it? And you're right, just have it play out on an ecological timescale.
And then I have a question about the ripping. So I've gone back and looked at a couple of our CIG sites, the Conservation Innovation Grants that we got that Michael French helped install in Eastern Pennsylvania. I was out there a couple of weeks ago looking at these sites. And when we first installed those CIG sites, we thought that you could do one pass with the ripping bar. And it was a 4-foot ripping bar. So it was a 4-foot ripping bar on a D9 dozer, rip one way. I think since then we've seen that the cross rip is better. So rather than one pass, do one pass and then do another pass down a grid and then plant in the intersection of those grids. It was my experience, particularly in the Michael Cole in Tremont, Pennsylvania, that we had a lot of frost heave. We had a lot of root constriction still, despite the ripping. So I don't know if you can speak to, and maybe you cover this and I just missed it. So you were 30 centimeters down with your ripping bar, and then was it one pass or was it a cross rip?
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Let me clarify that. For the ripping treatment, we were 1 meter down. and we cross ripped and planted in the cross. That was that treatment. The other treatment was the plow disc. And the reason why we did that, and I'm sure you're finding, it's hard to find someone and it's expensive to find someone to come out and deep rip. So we were also wanted to compare, okay, what would farmers have on hand? That would be a plow disc board, and that ripped 30 centimeters down. So those were the difference between those two treatments. Plow disc 30 centimeters, ripped was a meter, and then the mix of the plow disc ripping. And after 11, 12 years on the site, what we're seeing is those plow discs that were only 30 centimeters down catching up to our deep rip chestnuts. So that's why I'm kind of wondering, well, gee, are they hitting a hard pan that we just didn't get to, because there's very little that we do know about these soil profiles of these sites. And that right there is a whole cool study of getting a soil profile and understanding that a little more, getting a nice big soil pit out there. But again, time and money and getting to that site is challenging. So
I'd be really interested, and I think the ARRI guys, so the Appalachian Regional Reforestation Initiative, ARRI, I think they've done some evaluation, and I'm not really up on it, of the parent material and how much that affects whether or not. So, and I know that there's some differences. I wish I knew off the top of my head, like, brown parent material versus the blue parent material, and I don't know enough about it to speak real well about it. But I would be very interested in going back into some of these sites. We've got 12 of these CIG sites plus the ones that you've installed, doing some of these pits and looking how much compaction is still there, between the ripped areas. What is the parent material and how is that interacting with the chestnuts growth? Because your growth is much better than what I've seen on some sites. Now, on other sites, they've done well. We do have 30-foot fruiting trees on cross-ripped sites, so it can work.
Right. I love it. And in fact, let's talk a little more, because it would be great to get something not only about the depth, the root architecture. I'm also curious about mycorrhizae, how root depth is influenced by competition, how mycorrhizae are stratified in that soil profile. I think we have so many questions to answer. So let's keep talking about that. And maybe if you end up with something, or we'll talk, maybe we can see if we can return to some of these sites and do depth profiles.
And so real quick, just do you see any frost heave on your sites or on this site with the ripping?
Well, I have in the past. With fall plantings, they just pop out of the ground. We did a late spring planting, early spring. It was March 2007, and we think that timing helped with that frost heave. How about you, timing wise of planting?
This was a nut planting in early spring, and it looks like it's more. And I've had that issue with fall plantings. I do have frost heave issues more in the fall than I do in the spring. But that's why I was so surprised to see that on a nut. And I tend to have it more with seedlings than I do a seed. But that's why I was so surprised to see this on a seed-derived planting planted in the spring. We planted, it was sleeting. It was absolutely miserable planting this site. But yeah, they were up probably, I don't know, a foot, 12 inches pushed out of the ground.
I believe it. I believe it. Yeah, we've had trouble before too, but I thought maybe we fixed it with the spring planting, but apparently not. So it's probably right.
I think it's a function of how much, and maybe Laurel can correct me, but I think it's a function of clay content and how much is still in there, but yes. I'm not positive. All right, well, I don't know if there are any other, that is the end of our formal presentation. Laurel, thank you. Jenise, thank you. Jim Walizer, I think he's already gone away, and so has Jim Finley and Kim, but I really appreciate them all showing up and sharing a nice little tribute for Jim Walizer and his work. Mary, do you have any final words for the chapter? As I think this is your last meeting as president of the chapter. Thank you for all you've done these past couple of years.
Well, Sarah, again, thank you for running the meeting on Zoom. And I want to thank everyone who came. And I especially want to thank our speakers. It was absolutely fascinating. And it's something that I personally knew next to nothing about, and when it comes to growing chestnuts. And thank you very, very much for taking time out of your Saturdays to speak with us.
All right, thanks everybody. This is recording. I'll put that together and post it. You guys will all get an announcement when it's done. And Laurel, Jenise, I'll certainly be in touch. And thank you guys. Have a great rest of your weekend.
Thank you so much.
All right, bye everybody.
Bye-bye.